Hi, I'm Father Charlie Bouchard, and I'm here to offer you a few thoughts on the readings for the sixth Sunday in Ordinary Time, so that you will be able to know before you go to the Eucharist this weekend what these readings are about. A few years ago during COVID, I had a day where I wasn't feeling very well, sore throat, fever, and so forth. So I took one of those unpleasant tests and realized that, of course, I tested positive. And that resulted in me having to be isolated, to stay in my room for several days. I couldn't see anybody. I couldn't talk to anybody. My meals were delivered to me, and it was a pretty lonely experience. So one day, late at night, I decided to go down to the kitchen to get a snack. I thought, well, it's late. Nobody else is going to be up. And so I went downstairs, and to my surprise, I ran right into one of the other brothers. And he stopped, and I stopped. And he said, "What are you doing down here?" And I said, "Well, I didn't think anyone else was going to be around." Now, fortunately, no one else got sick because of my little transgression. But I thought about that experience today as I read about the leper in the first reading in the gospel, that these lepers were people who were shunned from the community, that they were permanently excluded from the life of the community because of their illness, that they had to, as the first reading says, live outside the camp. Now, you have to remember that the camp was a really important thing if you live in the desert, because that's where food was, that's where water was, that's where community was. And so, if you had to live outside the camp, your life was going to be pretty limited. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily a punishment, but it was just a fact of life with the communicable disease. And you can tell from the gospel today that this experience also had a spiritual dimension to it. The ancient Israelites tended to connect physical illness and sin in a way that we would not do today. So when Jesus encounters the leper, when the leper approaches him, which was pretty unusual right there that he would do that, even more unusual that Jesus would uh, be moved with compassion. And the leper says, "You can heal me if you want to." And Jesus says, "Of course I do." He was moved with compassion to do that. And so he heals the leper. And the point of the story is not just curing physical illness, but also curing spiritual illness or delivering people from sin. And as we hear that story, I think we should recall that even though sometimes we might be isolated by illness, there are other times when we isolate ourselves by our sin. For example, when we are harsh or cruel to someone, or when we have a family dispute that separates us from others, or when we um, uh, harbor vengeance or jealousy or anger, all of those things place us spiritually outside the camp. And we've all had that experience of having done something wrong to somebody and feeling alienated from them, or perhaps from a large group of people, that we, have wounded ourselves, placed ourselves outside the circle of the community by our sinfulness. It's at times like that when we need to come to Jesus, perhaps in confession, perhaps in some other way, and ask for the forgiveness and healing that God promises us. There is yet a third dimension to these stories about the lepers. Presumably, all of us here in the church today are relatively inside the camp. We probably have fairly stable lives. We have enough food to eat, enough water to drink. We've got shelter at night. And yet, every day, we encounter people who are outside the camp. In fact, just this morning, as I drove over here, I was at a stoplight, and there was a man who was going from car to car, with his sign. You've all seen them. Clearly, somebody who was living outside the camp in one sense, who was approaching those he thought lived inside the camp, saying, "Can you help me? We all run into this." And there are many, many other people who also live outside the camp, people whose ability to participate in the life of the community is severely limited, whether it's by disease or disability, just not being able to get out of the house, or being outside the camp because of age or race, maybe because of lack of employment or education, or maybe financial instability or inadequate housing. And then, of course, there are the millions of people who are put outside the camp, or at least on the edges of it, by the scourge and by the demon of addiction, that they cannot fully participate in life because they are bound to this addictive behavior, whether it's alcohol or drugs or something else. Sometimes, as I suggested, these persons who live outside the camp approach us. And sometimes, like most of the people who lived with Jesus, we're kind of hesitant to touch them. We want to say, don't get too close. It's not necessarily that we're afraid we're going to catch something from them. It's rather that we're afraid of the unknown and of these people who live a very different life with all kinds of problems and disabilities that we may not have, and we simply don't understand what it is they need or what we can do for them. But I think as we hear this gospel reading today, we can see the boldness of the leper, first of all, who recognized the power of Jesus. And then we see clearly the compassion of Jesus, that he wanted to heal this man and said so. He wanted to cure him of his disease. He wanted to deliver him from the effects of that isolation and that living outside the camp. I think that even though we ourselves sometimes experience that isolation, we have to remember that every day, what it's like to be outside the camp in any way that we might have been. And we have to ask the Lord to give us the same compassion that he had, to try to understand the loneliness and the isolation that these folks feel, and to say, God, soften my heart. Let me do what I can, either in terms of one gift or $1 here or there, or of political or social action, which will try to remedy some of the causes of this isolation. In that way, we can help the Lord assure, as he has promised, that all of us will be invited into the camp of salvation, and the camp of eternal life.